Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are tackling 3 words that often trip people up, even though they seem simple on the surface. We're diving into have, has, and had.
And you're right, they really are everywhere in English. What's amazing to me is how these little verbs are doing so much heavy lifting in our sentences. They're not just about possessing things.
You're totally right. I thought I had a pretty good grasp on these verbs before today, but after looking at the research for this episode, I realized there's a lot more to them than meets the eye.
Absolutely. It's easy to take them for granted until you really start thinking about all the different ways we use them.
Right, okay, we all learned that have is for present tense and had is for past tense, right? But then you start to see how they fit into those more complex grammatical structures, and it's like a whole new world opens up.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack today. We're going to see how these verbs are the key to understanding those perfect tenses, those modal phrases, and even some of the most common expressions we use every single day.
So to kick things off, let's talk about have and has in their most basic sense, possession.
Right. So at their core, these verbs tell us what belongs to someone or something, like she has a blue car, or they have a meeting at noon.
And just to be super clear, has is used for the third person singular, like he, she, or it, while have is used for everything else.
Exactly. Now, even though these examples are pretty straightforward, the source material points out that even simple possession can get nuanced depending on the context.
Oh, I totally see that. For example, I have a headache. Doesn't mean you own a headache, right? It's a way of expressing a state of being.
Precisely. And that's what makes these verbs so interesting. They can function on multiple levels, which is something we often do instinctively without even realizing it.
It's like our brains are mini grammar processors. Okay, so we've covered simple possession. But what I find really intriguing is how these seemingly simple verbs are also the gateway to understanding those more complex grammatical structures, like the perfect tenses.
Yes.
If you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to like the video. Share it with friends who might find it helpful. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. Let us know in the comments what topic you'd like to hear.
The perfect tenses. Now, I know that name can sound a little intimidating, but I promise you they're not as scary as they seem. And once you understand how they work, you can add so much more nuance and precision to your English.
Okay, so less intimidating, more like time-traveling verbs. I like it. But seriously, how would you explain what the perfect tenses are all about?
Well, you could think of them as a way of connecting actions to different points in time, creating these really specific relationships between events. And the key to forming them, you guess it, is using have, has, or had as auxiliary verbs.
So instead of just saying I walked, we can say I have walked, which tells us something slightly different, right?
Exactly. And depending on which helper verb have, has, or had we use, we're basically choosing which time frame we want to emphasize.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's break it down, starting with the present perfect tense. What makes this one special?
Well, think of the present perfect as a bridge between the past and the present. It's for actions or states that started in the past but are still relevant or have an impact on the present moment.
I see. So it's not about a specific time in the past, but rather about how that past action connects to right now.
Exactly. And the source uses the example, I have visited 10 countries. So we don't know exactly when those visits happened, just that they're done.
And that experience of visiting those countries is now a part of who you are. It's like been there, done that, grammatically speaking.
You got it.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. It's like the present perfect lets us talk about our experiences in a way that shows how they've shaped us.
Exactly. It's like those past actions have rippled through time and are still making waves in the present.
I love that. Okay, so we've got the present perfect linking the past to the present. What about the past perfect? That one always makes me think of those time travel movies where something has already happened before the story even begins.
Right. It's like we're peeking back into an even earlier layer of the past. The past perfect is all about an action that was completed before another action in the past.
Okay, so it's like a double past tense.
In a way, yes. And the source gives a really clear example. Let me see. By the time I arrived, the train had already left. So you see how it creates that sense of one thing happening before another in the past.
Yeah, it's like those few extra words, had, already, totally change the meaning of the sentence.
Absolutely. And I think that's why the past perfect can be so powerful in storytelling. It lets you create these layers of time and build suspense. Imagine reading a mystery novel and you come across a sentence like, the detective had just stepped into the room when he noticed the broken vase. You immediately want to know what had happened before he arrived, Right.
Yeah, you're hooked. Okay, so we've got the present perfect bridging the past and present, and the past perfect taking us back to an earlier point in the past. Now, what about the future perfect? That one sounds downright prophetic. Like,
Yeah.
are we going full on back to the future here?
Well, not quite. The future perfect isn't about predicting the future. It's more about expressing an action that will be completed by a specific point in the future.
Okay, so it's like we're fast forwarding to a point in the future and looking back at something that will be finished by then.
Exactly. And the source gives the example, by this time next year, I will have graduated from college. So it's not just about graduating at some point. It's about the certainty of it being done by a specific time in the future.
So it's like a way of saying, mark your calendars because this is happening.
Exactly. And, I think the future perfect can be really empowering, especially when you're setting goals or making plans. It's like you're grammatically claiming that future success.
I love that. It's like you're speaking it into existence. Okay, so we've gone from simple possession to time traveling with the perfect tenses. But the source material says there's even more to unpack when it comes to have, has, and had.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting because we start to see how these verbs pop up in all sorts of common expressions and idioms.
Oh, you're talking about those phrases we use all the time without even thinking about them, right?
Exactly. Things like have a good time, have breakfast, have an idea, even have a go at it. They're everywhere.
And what's fascinating is how these verbs add an extra layer of meaning to these expressions, often in ways that are quite different from simple possession.
Right. It's like they become almost metaphorical in a way. It's incredible how much depth they add to our language. But the source doesn't stop there. It also dives into something that often trips people up, using have, has, and had in negative and interrogative sentences.
Ah, yes, the land of do I have versus have I, didn't have versus hadn't. It's enough to make even the most confident English speakers second-guess themselves.
Seriously. It can feel like a grammatical minefield sometimes. But the source does a great job of breaking it down and showing that there are actually some pretty clear patterns at play.
Exactly. It's all about recognizing those patterns. And the key is to remember that they differ slightly between the present and past tenses. Okay, I'm ready to face this grammatical challenge head on. Let's start with the present tense. What are the rules when it comes to forming negatives and questions with have and has?
Well, in the present tense, our trusty helpers do and does come into play.
Oh, right. So we use those to create negatives like, I do not have any pets, or she does not have a car.
Well, you got it. And for questions, it's the same idea. Do you have any siblings? Or does he have a reservation? The source emphasizes that using do and does in this way is a really important part of forming correct present tense sentences.
And it's interesting how that changes when we move to the past tense. Suddenly, had becomes the star of the show, right?
Yeah, exactly. In the past tense, had steps up to the plate for both negatives and questions.
So instead of saying, I did not have time, we say, I had not, or even I hadn't time.
That's right. And for questions, it's simply, had you met her before?
It's interesting how had takes that front and center position in past tense questions, just like do and does did in the present. It's like there's this underlying symmetry to it all.
If you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to like the video. Share it with friends who might find it helpful. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. Let us know in the comments what topic you'd like to hear.
That's a great observation. And that's what I find so fascinating about English grammar. Even though it has its quirks, there are these underlying patterns and logic that make it all come together.
It really is amazing how much structure those three little words provide. Like, I always thought of grammar as these kind of rigid rules, but now I'm seeing it more like a puzzle,
Yeah.
And once you understand how the pieces fit together, it's actually really elegant.
Absolutely. It's like a code we use to communicate our thoughts and ideas in the most precise way possible.
I like that, a code. Okay, so after this deep dive into the wonderful world of have, has, and had, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be walking away with?
Well, I think the biggest thing is awareness. Once you start paying attention to how these verbs are used, you'll be amazed at how often they pop up in all sorts of different contexts. And that awareness will help you use them more confidently and accurately in your own writing and speaking.
So true. It's like with anything else. The more you practice, the more natural it becomes.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment. Try using the present perfect to talk about your experiences or the past perfect to add some intrigue to your stories. The more you play with these tenses, the more comfortable you'll become.
I love that. It's all about making those connections and seeing how these verbs can really bring your language to life. Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've gone from simple possession to time travel and everything in between.
And we've hopefully demystified these three little verbs that play such a big role in English grammar.
Exactly. So the next time you see have, has, or had, remember, they're not just humble verbs. They're the keys to unlocking a whole world of expressive possibilities in English.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of have, has, and had as much as we have. Until next time, happy language learning.